بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. كتاب الوصايا. Wasaya is the plural of the word wasiyatun, and wasiya, when we talk about it in Shara, it means تمليك مضاف إلى ما بعد الموت سواء كان عين أو منفعة. It is the bequest of a tangible asset or service whose ownership is given after the death of a person, not as a form of trade or exchange, but as a form of a gift. So basically, wasiya is a gift. It can be a gift of something that's tangible. It can be a gift of a service, which is given after the death of the person who's actually wanting to give this gift. So that's what wasiya is. Now we have evidence for wasiya from both the Quran and the Hadith. As far as the Quran is concerned, in the verses of inheritance, it mentioned من بعد وصية توصون بها أو دين, that the inheritance is distributed among the heirs after the wasiyah has been granted, after its wajib has been fulfilled, and after debts have been paid. And as far as the hadith is concerned, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu, he got really sick and he was on the verge of death. And so the Prophet Islam came to him, and Sa'd asked the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, Inna mali kafi wa laysa yarithuni illa bint li wahid, that I have a lot of wealth, and the only person who's inheriting from me is just one daughter, and I have no other family except for her. And so the Prophet Islam, he asked the Prophet Islam, Afa usi bi mali kulli, should I give all of my wealth, should I bequest all of my wealth? He said no. And then Sa'd asked, Afa binisbihi, should I give half my wealth? And the Prophet ﷺ replied, no. And then he mentioned, For bithuluthi, should I give 1/3 of my wealth? And then the Prophet ﷺ said, Na'am wa thuluthu kafi. Yes, and even a third is a lot. And then he mentioned something that all of us should keep in mind. He said, إِنَّكَ يَا سَعْدْ أَن تَدَعَ وَرَثَتَكَ أَغْنِيَةً خَيْرٌ مِّن تَدَعَهُمْ عَالَةً يَتَكَفَّفُونَ النَّاسَ. O Sa'd, to leave your heirs, to leave your family behind in a state of ghina, in which they're not in need of people, they have wealth, is much better to leave them in a state in which they're forced to beg and forced to spread their arms in front of people. And so a lot of us, we want to do good deeds, we want to make sadaqat, but always remember that spending on your own family, that's also a sadaqah. And one of the greatest sadaqahs there is, I mean, to help out the poor. That's really important too within a society. But sometimes what happens is people, in their want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in their choice to actually please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and make sadaqah, they forgo the rights of their families. And so this is something all of us should be careful about, as in not to do that. So anyhow, these were the evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah about wasiya being a permissible act. Then wasiya, it has some conditions which need to be filled, and it has some asbab as well. But before we go any further, you need to understand 4 to 5 terms that are used in this chapter. The first word is musi. So the musi is the person making the wasiya. Or you can say that person is almost about to die. The second word is musa lahu. That is the person for whom the wasiya is being made. The third word is musa bihi, and that is the thing that is being requested. And the fourth word is Musa ilayhi. That is the person that the Musi is making as his naib or as his representative after his death, who's going to make sure that his bequest is fulfilled and all those responsibilities that a person might have are being met. So again, you have a wasiya, that is the bequest. Musi, the person making the bequest, the wasiya. Musa lahu, the person for whom the bequest is being made. Musa bihi, the thing that is being bequested, the thing that is being given in wasiya. And Musa ilayhi, the person who that Musi is putting in charge of carrying out his wasiya. Right? Once you've established these five terminologies, we go to the conditions of wasiya. So the first thing is the Musi should be ahlan lit tamlik, meaning he should be someone who can actually do tasarruf and give something. So a child cannot be a Musi because he can't make such decisions on his own. Similarly, a slave cannot be a Musi because he owns nothing of his own. An insane person cannot be a Musi because he too, just like a child, does not own tasarruf on his own accord. Second condition is that the Musi should not be in debt. I mean, his debt should not be such that he has nothing left afterwards. So if he's so deep in debt that all of his inheritance, all of what he leaves behind is going to go in covering his debt, then he can't make wasiya. Because paying one's debt is comes first, then giving wasiya. Because wasiya is at most mustahab, but paying your debts is actually a wajib. Condition number three is that the Musa lahu should be alive at that time. So the person for whom the bequest is being made should actually survive after the death of the Musi. Because if the Musa lahu dies before the Musi, then that wasiya becomes invalid because you can no longer give that to a dead person, and so he can't be accepted it. Also, wasiya, the fifth condition is that wasiya should not be made for one of your heirs or your murderer. What this actually means is if someone makes a wasiya for a person and then that person actually murders the Musi, then he is going to be stopped from it. I mean, he's not going to receive any of what was bequested to him. Yeah, the lesson is being recorded, so you can access it later, inshallah. So again, condition number five was that the wasiya should not be made for a warith, an heir, wala qatil, and the wasiya is invalid for the person who actually murdered the Musi. And number six is whatever he's making wasiya of, whatever he's requesting, should be something that can be transferred to another person. If something is untransferable to another person, you can't do that. So you can't make wasiya of, let's say, the share of the one who inherits you. So let's say you leave behind uh, your parents. You can't make a wasiya of giving the share of your parents from your inheritance to some third person because your parents share something you have no control over, and mirath or inheritance is something that does not accept intiqal. It doesn't accept transfer to another party, and so you can't make wasi of that. And so these are the six conditions that are supposed to be met in order for a wasiya to be valid. Now, obviously, when we talk about fiqh, we talk about its legal status. So, what is the legal status of wasiya? So, you mentioned in the book, al-wasiyatu ghayru wajibatin wa hiya mustahabba, that making the bequest is not obligatory, but it is recommended. This is what the hukum is today. At the start of Islam, when the verses of inheritance weren't revealed yet, the Prophet of Islam, he said that none of you truly believes until none of you actually believes if a night passes without them having their bequest prepared, which means that initial time of Islam, having your wasiyah prepared at all times was wajib, right? But after, because if there was no wasiyah, then after a person's death, inevitably fighting would emerge on who gets what part or who gets how much of the money that they've left behind. But after the verses of inheritance were revealed and everybody's shares were fixed, that fighting was no longer there. And so it's no longer wajib, but now it's only mustahab. But it's a good thing to have one's will prepared, and the things that they should mention in it, especially, are if they have any debts they haven't paid yet, so that after they're gone, their mal will be first used to pay off the debts, because debt is something that a person will be held accountable for. Even a person who is a shaheed, so a martyr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Prophet Islam, he mentions, يُغْفَرُ لِلشَّهِيدِ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ إِلَّا الدَّيْنِ, that for the martyr, every sin is forgiven except for the dain, for he's accountable for the debt he owes other people. And so the first thing that you should mention in your wasiyah is if you owe someone something. Second thing that a person should mention in their wasiyah is if they have any farz salah or farz sawm that they have to make qaza of. So if you have any qaza prayer or any qaza fasts on you, you should also mention that. If you haven't paid your zakat for whatever period of time, you should also mention that. So every farz and wajib, whether related to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or to the people, it should be mentioned in your will, so that can be taken care of. And the third thing that you can mention is if you want to give some of your mal to charity after you're gone, then you can make a wasiyah of it. Then he mentions things that you cannot do in wasiyah. وَلَا تَجُوزُ الْوَصِيَّةُ لِلْوَارِثِ إِلَّا أَنْ يُجِيزَهَا الْوَرَثَةُ. Wasiyah cannot be, a bequest cannot be made for the inheritors, the heirs, any of them, except if the others allow it, right? So you can't make a wasiyah to your heir. The Prophet Islam, he mentions, Inna Allah qad a'ta kulla dhi haqqin haqqa, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has appointed or given every person their rightful share. Ala la wasiyata li warith. And so there is no wasiyah for a warith. And the reason why they're not giving that wasiyah for a warith is not acceptable, for an heir is not acceptable, is because of the right of the others, or the other heirs. So let's say you leave behind your parents, right? And let's say you leave behind your spouse or your children. You can't make wasiyah, let's say, especially specifically just for your children or just for your spouse or for your parents, because in that case, the right of the others, let's say the right of your children or the right of your parents, is going to suffer because of it. Except if they allow it, then that's okay, because in that case, they're actually this, it's the same as they're giving it themselves, so that's not a problem. But remember, this can only be done, I mean, the other waratha can only give permission if they meet two conditions. All of them should be mentally stable, which means if any one of the waratha is insane, then the others can't grant permission to this warasa, this warith for whom the bequest is being made. Similarly, they should all be adults. If there's a child amongst the waratha, then none of them can give permission to that person. وَلَا يَجُوزُ بِمَا زَادَ عَلَى الثُّلُثِ. Similarly, a wasiyah cannot be made more than one third of a person's wealth. Like we mentioned in the hadith of Sa'd radiallahu anhu, الثلث والثلث كثير, that one third, and that is a lot as well. Anything more than one third and wasiyah will not be acceptable. It's mentioned in other hadith, the Prophet Islam, he mentioned, Al-hayfu fil wasiyati min akbar al-kabair, that transgression in making bequests is one of the biggest of major sins. Amongst the major sins, it is one of the biggest. Transgression in wasiyah. But what does that actually mean? So there have been two different uh, tafsir of this hadith, explanations, and both of them can be applied at the same time. One is a ziyada ala thulus, that making a bequest of more than one third of your wealth, that is a major sin. Also, making a wasiyah for a bequest for one of your heirs, that is a major sin. And so both these things should be avoided. وَلَا تَجُوزُ الْوَصِيَّةُ لِلْقَاتِلِ, and a bequest for his murderer cannot be made. And the translation that you have in front of you says that the bequest in favor of a homicide is not permitted. This is, well, that's so obvious that it not need be mentioned. You can have a bequest asking someone to kill someone else. So this doesn't make, translation doesn't fit properly. So it's what I referred to earlier, lil qatil, that the person who's going to kill the musi, maybe in the future on, for him wasiya is not permissible, means that it will be invalid, that it cannot be acted upon. It's not permissible that the wasiya should be applicable on such a person. ويجوز أن يوصي المسلم للكافر والكافر للمسلم. And in both ways, it's permissible that either a Muslim makes a bequest for a non-Muslim or a non-Muslim making a bequest for a Muslim. That is acceptable. As will come on the later chapter, then inheritance between Muslims and non-Muslims, that doesn't run. I mean, a non-Muslim cannot inherit from a Muslim, and a Muslim cannot inherit from a non-Muslim. But as far as wasaya are concerned, bequests are concerned, they're acceptable. Like in the Quran, it's mentioned, لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوا من دياركم أن تبروهم. That Allah does not stop you from actually doing good to those non-Muslims who aren't fighting you for your religion, who didn't force you out of your homes, right? And so by non-Muslim, we don't mean all non-Muslims, we mean those whom which you are not fighting with. So if in a state of war with a non-Muslim country, then you can't make a bequest for them. But as long as you're in a place where there are non-Muslims, but you're not in a state of constant fighting, you aren't being oppressed there, then it's not a problem if you made wasiyah for them. وقبول الوصية بعد الموت. And acceptance of the bequest is after the death of the musi, right? Because like we mentioned in the definition of wasiyah, that it is a gift given after the death. So unless it's given to you, you don't have the option of accepting or rejecting it. So as long as he's alive, you can accept or reject it. So after the Musa dies, the Musa lahu has the option of either accepting the bequest or rejecting it because it's a gift. And just like any other gift, you need to either accept or reject it. If he accepts it, then from if it's one third, he will get it. If he rejects it, then all of this would go back to the original taraka, the wealth that is left behind, and be distributed among the waratha as per the shares. فإن قبلها موسى له في حال الحياة أو ردها. So if the Musa lahu, for whom the wasiyah was made, he accepts during the lifetime or rejects during the lifetime of the Musi, then both this acceptance and rejection is void. Like we mentioned, you can't accept or reject something until it's being given to you, and that only happens after the Musi dies. ويستحب أن يوصي الإنسان بدون الثلث. And mustahab is that he actually gives less than thuluth. In up till suluth, you can bequest your wealth, not more than that. But still, it's better that you don't do the bequest of a complete thuluth. It should be less than that. Because in this way, you're actually doing a minna or doing a last minute or your very last act of kindness to your own family. Now I'm talking about the Musa Ilahi, the person who's being made in charge of fulfilling the requests of the Musi. وإذا أوصى إلى رجل فقبل الوصية في وجه الموصي وردها في غير وجهه فليس برد وإن ردها في وجهه فهو رد. So when the Musi bequeaths to a man, he makes him his wasi, and that person actually accepts the bequest in the presence of the Musi. But behind his back, he actually declines it. Then this refusal of his is invalid. Because once he accepted it to the Musi that I'll fulfill your bequests, the Musi actually, he's probably mutmain, he's okay, he's satisfied that my bequest is going to be met. And he ends his life knowing that I made someone responsible. But if that Musa lahu is rejecting or refusing behind his back, and the Musi doesn't know, then obviously he won't make any other arrangements for it. So that will cause problems in having determined or in having fulfill whatever the Musi actually asked him. But if he refuses in front of the Musi, when the Musi says that I'm bequesting to you and he says that I don't accept, then that's okay. Which means that now the Musi has time to or has the chance to appoint someone else. Mm. والموسى به يملك بالقبول إلا في مسألة واحد. Like we mentioned earlier that al-Musa bihi, the thing being bequested, it has to be accepted before it can actually transfer ownership, because it's a gift, except for one scenario in which there's no need for qubul, or you can say even before accepting it, it's accepted. And that is the case. Let's say the Musi dies, and before the Musa lahu could either accept or reject, he also dies. And so in this case, the Musa bihi, or the bequested item, will directly enter into the property of the heirs of the Musa lahu, the heirs of the one who was, for whom the bequest was being made. It will enter into their ownership, even though the original Musa lahu never actually accepted it. But you can say that his death will be considered as him accepting it. And so this property or this cash or whatever it is will transfer into the ownership of the waratha of the Musa lahu and not the Musi. So the bequest becomes owned by acceptance. Illa fi masla wahid, except in one case, in which the Musi dies and then the Musa lahu also dies prior to acceptance. And so in this case, the bequested item enters the property of the heirs of the deceased. And by the deceased, we here refer to the musalahu, the person from whom the original bequest was made. ومن أوصى إلى عبد أو كافر أو فاسق أخرجهم القاضي من الوصية ونسب غيره. And if someone bequeaths a slave, and by slave he means someone else's slave, not his own, or he bequeaths to a disbeliever, or he bequeaths to a dissolute, a fasiq, أخرجهم القاضي من الوصية ونسب غيرهم. The judge will exclude them from the bequest and appoint someone else, meaning the wasiyah is acceptable, but the people that he has appointed in these three scenarios, they are unacceptable in order to actually uh, be entrusted to sufficiently comply with the conditions of the wasiyah or actually be trusted to fulfill the wasiyah. Similarly, if they make a wasiyah to a child, then in that case, the qazi will remove the child from being the Musa ilay and appoint someone else. But if a child will become an adult, or if the non-believer accepts Islam, or if that slave is freed, before the judge or the qadi actually appoints someone instead of in place of them, then in these cases, they will remain as being the wasi, they will remain as being the Musa ilayhim, and will be tasked to fulfill whatever the will entails. ومن أوصى إلى عبد نفسه وفي الورثة كبار لم تصح الوصية. And if someone bequeaths to their own slave while they have elder children or elders amongst the heirs, then in this case the bequest is invalid. Understand if a person, they make a bequest to their slave, task them with actually fulfilling the wasiyah, and all the waratha, their siqar, their children, because children can't make their own decisions and they don't understand how the world properly works, there's a high chance that they won't be able to survive on their own. There's a chance that they'll lose all their wealth, waste all their wealth. In order to stop that, a responsible person, if it's their own slave, then he can make him the wasiyah. But if the children are adults, I mean, if the waratha are all adults, they can make their own decisions. Heck, even the abd or that person's slave enters into the ownership of those adult heirs, which means they can stop him from doing anything at any time. They can sell their shares of that slave anytime. And so basically, if there are adults among the heirs of the deceased, then the slave as a Musa ilahi is ineffective. And that's why this wasiyah will be invalid, because the purpose behind the wasiyah will not be met in this case. ومن أوصى إلى من يعجز عن القيام بالوصية ضم إليه القاضي غيره. If someone bequeaths to someone who is incapable of implementing the bequest, a judge can associate another person with him. Incapable in terms of, let's say, they don't live in the same country, they live somewhere else. They're very busy in onto themselves. They can't make all the decisions in due time. Or maybe they're weak in, let's say, their experience in the world. If it's a new adult, a child who just recently became an adult, he may not know what to do exactly. So in any case, if someone is incapable of implementing the bequest completely on their own, the judge can appoint someone to assist them in this regards. Up till now, we discussed the issues that can arise if there's only one wasi, if there's only one Musa ilayhi. Sometimes what can happen is the Musi can make more than one Wasi. He can make more than one Musa ilay. So what are the implications of such a thing? Mentions وَمَنْ أَوْصَى إِلَى اثْنَيْنِ. If someone bequeaths two people, لم يجوز لأحدهما أن يتصرف عند أبي حنيفة ومحمد رحمهم الله دون صاحبه. Then according to the طرفين, which means Abu Hanifa and Muhammad rahimahullah, they say that one cannot make any transaction, cannot make any decision without the other. I mean, they both should be present, or there should be mutual consent before making a decision, except in a few cases. For example, في شراء كفن الميت وتجهيزه. So the purchase of a shroud for the deceased and his funeral preparations. There's no need for both of them to be present in order to make this decision. Number one. Number two, or as you mentioned, number three is وَطَعَامِ أَوْلَادِ الصِّغَارُ قِسْوَتِهِمْ. That food for his children and their clothing if they're minor. So minor children, their food and clothing, you don't need to wait for your partner wasi in order to make this decision. Obviously, it's necessary for their survival, so you can make such decisions without having the consult of the other. The return of specific deposits. So if there's something you know that belongs to person X, you don't need to wait for your partner in order to make the decision to give back to person X. You just do it. وَتَنْفِيذ وَصِيَّةٍ بِعَيْنِهَا. And if he is specify the wasiya, so let's say he says that give 1/3 of my wealth to charity XYZ or to helping hands. Now he specified where that wasiya is to be used. Then you don't have to wait for the other wasi in order to make this decision. You can give that 1/3 in charity to that particular institution. وَعِتْقُ عَبْدٍ بِعَيْنِهِ. And if you specify the slave that he has that needs to be freed, then you don't have to wait for the other wasi in order to free that slave. One is enough to enforce that decision. Similarly, وَقَضَاءُ الدَّيْنِ وَالْخُصُومَةِ فِي حُقُوقِ الْمَيِّتِ. If there are debts to be paid or any other litigations in respect to the deceased, you don't have to wait for the other wasi or the other musalahu before you actually go ahead to fulfill these things. Other than that, any other decision that is to be made with both of them present, or at the minimum with the consultation of both, even if it's only one that's enforcing all of it. ومن أوصى لرجل بثلث ماله وللآخر بثلث ماله ولم تجز الورثة فالثلث بينهما نصفان. If I make a bequest of 1/3 to one person, let's say person X, and then I make a bequest of my wealth of 1/3 to person Y, and the waratham, my heirs don't actually accept. They don't give permission for this. فَالثُّلُثُ بَيْنَهُمَا نِصْفَانِ. That then only 1/3 will be divided in two halves amongst X and Y. As we established, you can't make a bequest of more than 1/3. So if you see the original masala, I'm actually making a bequest of 2/3, 1/3 for X and 1/3 for Y. And so the maximum threshold for it is being exceeded. for a bequest is being exceeded. So in this case, 1/3 will be divided equally amongst X and Y. وإن أوصى لأحدهما بالثلث وللآخر بالسدس فالثلث بينهما الثلاث. If he makes a bequest to X for 1/3 and to Y for 1/6, then in this case, a third will be divided amongst them, with X getting 1 share and Y getting, oh sorry, X getting 2 shares and Y getting 1 share. I mean that 1/3 of the bequest will be divided into 3 parts, one of which will be given to Y, who was originally bequested 1/6, and 2 of them will be given to X, who was originally bequested 1/3. So if you know your fractions, you can easily chart out why that is. I'm not really good at maths, so I don't know how to explain that, but I have these figures written in front of me. Third masala of the same category. وَإِنْ أَوْصَى لِأَحَدِهِمَا بِجَمِيعِ مَالِهِ. He bequests his entire property to one person, person X, وَلِلْآخَرِ بِثُلُثِ مَالِهِ, and makes a bequest of 1/3 of his wealth to another person, person Y. وَلَمْ تُجِزِ الْوَرَثَةِ, and the waratha, they don't allow this. فَالثُّلُثُ بَيْنَهُمَا عَلَى عَرْبَةِ أَسْهُمٍ عِنْدَ أبي يوسف ومحمد رحمهم الله. The Sahibain say that now 1/3 will be divided into 4 parts. 3 will be given to person X, for whom the bequest of entire wealth was being made, and 1 share of it will go to person Y, for whom a third of the original wealth was being bequested. وقال أبو حنيفة رحمه الله الثلث بينهما نصفان. But Imam Abu Hanifa says that the 1/3 will be divided amongst them equally. So the Imam's logic is pretty simple. He says that anything being made more than 1/3 will be reduced back to 1/3, because you can't make more than that. You can't make a bequest more than that. So this masala is the same as the first masala, in which he first made 1/3 bequest to X and then a 1/3 bequest to Y. And as we mentioned over there, that 1/3 will be equally divided amongst X and Y. And so in this last masala, it will be the same, because when he made a bequest of his entire wealth for X, that is the same as making a bequest of only 1/3, because you cannot exceed 1/3 of your entire wealth. And the fatwa is actually on Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion that any bequest being made more than 1/3 will be reduced back to 1/3. ولا يضرب أبو حنيفة للموسى له بما زاد على الثلث. Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah does not give the Musa lahu anything that exceeds the third, except for in 3 cases: al-muhabat, as-si'aya, wal-darahim al-mursala. Need to understand each of them separately. What is muhabat? So the Suratul Mas'ala of muhabat is something like this. Let's say I have 2 slaves, or let's say 2 cars, to make it more understandable. One of the cars is worth, considering $1,100, and the other is worth only 600. So I'm making 2 bequests. One to sell my first car worth $1,100 for only $100 to person X, right? So in this case, I'm making a bequest of actually $1,000 because something that was worth 1100, I'm selling it for only 100. And then I say that for person Y, sell him my phone for $100, which was worth 600, or my car, whatever example it is. Over here, I'm making a bequest for person Y for $500 because 100 he's paying, but 500, a bequest is being made, right? So this is called as muhabat, that something is being sold for much less than its actual worth. So for one person, I'm doing a muhaba of $1,000. And for the other, I'm doing a muhaba of $500. And this entire $1,500 of muhabat is basically a wasiyah. I'm basically selling you something much less than its original price, or in other words, that we can basically say that I actually am making a bequest of you, a bequest for you, for person X for 1,000 and for person Y for $500. And remember, this is happening in halatul maraz, when a person is on their deathbed. Because if they're not on their deathbed, this will be considered as normal sale and not a bequest. And so I can have something worth $1 million, and if I'm in good health, I have the option of selling it for dirt cheap. There's nothing stopping me. But once a person enters the phase of terminal illness or when they're on their deathbed, their mal or their wealth is now actually connected to that person's heirs, which means they have a haq in it now, they have a right in it now. And so you cannot make any tasarruf which you could do in your normal life. So now these $1,500 are now all of it is wasiyah. So consider that $1,500 fits in the 1/3 of the entire wealth that I possess. Then all 1,500 will be given in wasiyah, no questions asked. But if my entire wealth does not allow 1,500 to be, let's say, if my entire wealth does not allow $1,500 to be 1/3 of it, right? And the warasa also do not agree. That's the second condition. Because if they do, then problem solved. But if they don't, and my entire wealth does not allow $1,500, then in this case, this muhabat will be fixated on 1/3. This 1,500 will be on 1/3. And this will be divided in three hisas, two which will be going to person X, from whom I bequested $1,000, and one will be given to person Y, from whom I bequested $500. And you can see how this works, right? Uh, so 500 is actually half of 1,000, or 1,000 is twice of that of 500. So whatever the 500 person gets, if that's one share, then the person getting 1,000 gets twice of it. So that's two shares. So hopefully the masala was understandable. The second masala is that of si'aya. Although it does not concern us these days because si'aya is actually involves slaves only. But we'll look at it anyway, just to understand how wasi is working. So let's say I have two slaves. One is worth $1,000, and the other one is worth $2,000. And I don't have any other wealth except these two slaves, right? So I free both of them. And if the waratha accept, then obviously there's no problem. But what if the waratha do not accept? Then in this case, only one third. So I have a total of $3,000, right? Like I mentioned, I have nothing except these two slaves, which means that one third of 3,000 is $1,000. My freeing them can only occur in $1,000. Now I want to free both of them, obviously. So the question is, do I free only the $1,000 slave and let this $2,000 remain in captivity? Or is there something else that is to be done? So, like we mentioned, one third will be divided amongst them. Again, a thalathan. So $1,000 from $1,000, $333 will be for the one who was worth 1,000, and 666 would be for the one who was worth 2,000, which means consider that the one was the slave who was worth $1,000. 333 of his value has been decreased or paid, and now he will earn a further $666 and give it to the waratha, and then he'll be free. And for the one who was worth $2,000, $666 have been paid, which means he now has to make an effort of $1,333 and then give it to the waratha, and then he'll be free again. And the third masla is that of the darahim al-mursala. So what happens in darahim mursala? Well, darahim mursala is basically what we've been discussing up till now. I make a bequest for person X for $2,000 and person Y for $1,000, right? And my thuluthul mal is only $1,000. Warasa don't allow it, so that'll be divided amongst them in 3/3, which means that the one X who I bequested $2,000 gets $666, and Y who I bequested $1,000 gets $333, because the maximum that I can give in a wasiya is only $1,000 because I don't have more than that to give. So hopefully you understood this masala, and if not, I can actually try and repeat it, make it more simple. ومن أوصى وعليه دين يحيط بماله لم تجز الوصية إلا أن يبرئ الغرماء من الدين. أن يبرأ الغرماء من الدين. Whoever makes a bequest and there is a debt which he owes which overwhelms his property, then such a bequest is not permitted unless the creditors they actually release him from the debt. So this one's pretty obvious. So if I make a bequest of let's say $1,000, but and that the total that I owe is 2,000, but I have debt which actually exceeds $2,000, let's say $2,500, then I can't make this bequest because in order the things that need to be met are number one, a person's debt, number two, the wasiya, and number three is inheritance. So as long as there's debt, I cannot make a wasiya, and even if I make a wasiya, it won't be enforced, and neither will the waratha get anything. So in this case, similarly, if I make a wasiya but I have debt which overwhelms my property, which is more than what I actually owe, then a wasiya that I've been made is invalid except for in the case if the creditors, they forgive my dain. They forgive all the debt that I owed them. And in this case, again, since I now own wealth in which wasiya can be made, then the wasiya will be acceptable. وَمَنْ أَوْصَى بِنَصِيبِ ابْنِهِ. And if someone actually bequeaths the share of his son, فَالْوَصِيَّةُ بَاطِلٌ, then the bequest is void. And this turns to that last condition that we mentioned in wasiya, that the thing of which you're making the wasiya should have the ability to be transferred. It should be transferable. Giving someone else's share from their inheritance is not something that's transferable. You can't transfer that. And so this wasiya is invalid, it's void, because it doesn't have the property of being transferred. وَإِنْ أَوْصَى بِمِثْلِ نَصِيبِ ابْنِهِ جَازَتْ. But if he actually makes a wasiya similar to the share of his son, then that's acceptable. You're not giving your son's share, you're giving the amount that your son would receive, or the similar amount of that in wasiya. So that's acceptable. A condition, it meets all the other requirements of the wasiya. فَإِنْ كَانَ لَهُ إِبْنَانِ. And if he has two sons, then obviously the Musa lahu gets the maximum 1/3. You can't exceed 1/3. وَمَنْ أَعْتَقَ عَبْدَهُ فِي مَرَضِهِ أَوْ بَاعَ وَحَابَ أَوْ وَهَبَ فذلك كله جائز وهو معتبر من الثلث ويضرب به مع أصحاب الوصايا. Whoever sets a slave free during his terminal illness on his deathbed, or sells and performs muhaba, like we mentioned muhaba just before, that it's actually selling something way cheaper than what it's actually worth. Aw wahaba, or if someone gives a gift in their terminal illness, فذلك كله جائز, all of it's permitted, ومعتبر من الثلث, but from only 1/3 of his property. And all these people, the free slave, the one being gifted, and the one who's being sold on muhabat, they will be min ashabil wasaya, for people who make, for whom wasiya is being made. The crux of it is that any tasarrufun maliyun, any uh, tasarruf that a person does in their wealth in terminal illness is considered as being a wasiya. So once you reach that point where there's no coming back, where you'll probably die, anything you do with your wealth will be considered as being a wasiya. So you don't have to actually say the words wasiya. You may be selling something, you may be freeing a slave, or you may be gifting someone, but all of it will be considered as being wasiya, which means that it can only be done from 1/3 of your entire wealth with all the conditions of the wasiya. If other than these actions you made an other wasiya to give, let's say, some of your wealth to helping hands, for example, then these people, the slave you free, the person you gifted, and the person you sold to, will also be part of that fi'ah, that group, which will be receiving part of your wealth, 1/3 of the wealth, after the musi passes away. فإن حاب ثم أعتق فالمحاباة أولى عند أبي حنيفة رحمه الله. If a person performs muhabat, I mean he sells on dirt cheap price first, and then he slaves the free. And remember, all this is happening in their terminal illness. Then Imam Hanifa says that muhabat is better than i'taq. And if we go the other way around, he frees a slave and then he performs muhabat, then he says they're both the same. What this actually means is that if he does muhabat and then frees a slave, then according to Imam Abu Hanifa, the priority is given to the person of muhabat, which means from 1/3 of his wealth, if the muhaba is being complete, it'll be completed first, and whatever remains will be given to the slave that is being freed. But if the slave was freed first and then the muhabat was done, in this case, they're both equal, which means that they both equal will be treated equally when actually being given from the bequest. And the Sahibin say that in both cases, it doesn't matter which comes first, they're both equal, which means that one third will be divided amongst them, not on a first come first served basis, but as is, as both of them being at the same time. So what the possible implication is, let's say the limit that I have of making a bequest, one third is $1,000 again. The muhabat I did was worth $900, and the freeing of the slave was worth, let's say the slave was worth $500. So if I did muhabat first, Imam Abu Hanifa says 900 will be given in the muhabat and only $100 to the slave, which means that the slave is going to have to make an extra effort to earn $400 to give to my waratha, and then he'll be completely free. And let's say if I did the muhabat of $1,000, all of it will be given to that person, and the slave that I freed will remain as a slave and will be given to my waratha. Make it the other way around, in which I free a slave first and then do muhabat. Same conditions, $1,000 my limit of making a wasiyah. In this case, the Imam says it will be divided equally or as per the shares. So 2/3, which means $666, will be given to the muhabat because that was worth $1,000 or $900. Let's say $1,000. So 666 will be given to that, and 333 will be given to the slave. The Sahibin say it doesn't matter which comes first. In no case will a priority be given to any of them. And so for them, in every case, the muhabat gets 666 and the slave gets $333 checked off from his account. Sorry, I made a mistake when discussing the Sahibin's masla. It's not that they're both equal. They say فَالْعِتْقُ أَوْلَى, that freeing the slave is better in both cases, which means that whether or not you free the slave first and then do muhabat, or do muhabat and then free the slave, in both cases, the Sahibin give priority over freeing the slave, which means he will be taken into account first. So we mentioned the slave was worth 500, which means $500 will be given to the slave. He'll be completely free. And the remaining 500 will be spent as a muhabat, which means that person can only be given a discount of worth $500 and not worth 900 or $1,000. So hopefully that's also clear. ومن أوصى بسهم من ماله فله أخص السهام الورثة إلا أن ينقص عن سدس فيقمم له السدس. Now in this case, if I make a wasiya of a portion of my wealth, I don't specify. I just say that you get a share of my wealth to a person. So a share is something that's very vague. What could a share mean? A share could mean one third, it could mean two thirds, it could mean one sixth, it could mean one eighth, it could be anything, right? So I bequest a share of my wealth. So what exactly is a share? So he mentions that فَلَهُ أَخَصُّ سِحَامِ الْوَرَثَةِ. Then we determine share as being the minimum that any of the waratha can receive. This will actually depend on the waratha themselves. A person who has, well, inheritance comes right after this topic, so obviously we're going to do inheritance after it. But remember that this masala can only be completely understood when you've done inheritance, because you need to know, because for each person this masala will be different. But as a basic concept, what he's trying to say is, if you made an unspecified share as a bequest, that a portion of my wealth, how much portion will be given? They say that the person making the wasiya take all of his heirs into account. Whichever heir receives the least amount, that much portion will be decided as being the one bequested. So let's say the minimum that a person can receive amongst his heirs is a fourth, right? Then a fourth will be considered as also being given in the wasiya. إلا ينقص عن السدس. But if it's less than 1/6, then it'll be at least 1/6 will be completed as a bequest. It is possible for one of the waratha to receive an eighth of the whole wealth, which is less than a 1/6. But the minimum that you can actually go in a bequest is 1/6. But if none of your waratha gets 1/6, all of them get higher than that. Let's say one gets 1/4, the other gets 2/3, one gets 1/3, right? In this case, the one receiving the least share, which is the 1/4, that much share will be given to the person for whom the bequest is being made. وإن أوصى بجزء من ماله قيل للورثة أعطوه ما شئتم. And if he bequeaths part of his property, doesn't specify what part, doesn't specify whether it's the house, the car, the phone, or the cash in his account, just anything, then قيل للورثة, it is said to the heirs, أعطوه ما شئتم. You can give him from anything. You can give him from part of the house, the car, the cash, whatever it is that you want to give that person. But if he has specified the property from which the bequest is being made, then it should be fulfilled. ومن أوصى بوصايا من حقوق الله تعالى قدمت الفرائض منها على غيرها قدمها الموصي أو أخرها مثل الحج والزكاة والكفارات وما ليس بواجب قدم منه ما قدمه المسلم. If someone makes bequests regarding the performance of rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the obligations or other acts of ibadat, first priority is given to the farais over the other things. It doesn't matter in which order the musi actually made the bequest. In all cases, the farais will get priority over the nawafil. And all of the things which are not obligatory, mean the nawafil, then order will be the same given by the musi. Let's make an example. Supposedly, I haven't performed Hajj, I have to do that. I have 10 prayers that I had to make qaza of. I didn't give zakat for 3 years, right? These are my farais, my wajibat. Also, I said that I give some of my wealth to, let's say, Bait Salam Welfare Trust, give some of it to my neighbors, and some of it to, let's say, a cat shelter. So I have 3 farais and 3 uh, nawafil, or let's say something that's not farz on me. First priority goes to the farz. So the Hajj, the prayer, and the zakat. Doesn't matter which order, they can give it in any of those. Number one. Number two is then things that are not wajib, you have to take in the order which is set by the musi. In this case, me. So after your farais are done, or let's say you don't have any farais, the first thing you have to do is give it to Baitul Salam, because that was the thing that I mentioned first for whom I made the bequest. The second that I made the bequest was for my neighbors. So they are second to receive whatever bequest is being made. And the third was for the cat shelter. And so the cats will be receiving it at the very last. Or let's mix it all up. So I am about to die, make a bequest, give it to the cat shelter. I have 10 prayers left. Complete that, give it to Betul Salam Welfare Trust, give it to my neighbors. I have Hajj left, perform that. I've mixed the farais and the non-farais. So what do you do first? You take out the farais, give them priority. My 10 salah and my Hajj, you take it first. You perform that if my wealth allows, if one third allows. Then afterwards, the non-farais are left. In this example, the cat shelter gets priority because I mentioned that first. Then comes Baitul Islam Welfare Trust because that I mentioned second. And lastly comes my neighbors because I mentioned them third, right? So you get the gist of it that if I make a wasiya of farais and non-farais, the farais get priority in no specific order. And in the non-farais, the order dictated by the Musi is the order that should be followed or must be followed. ومن أوصى بحجة الإسلام أحج عنه رجلا من بلده يحج راكبا فإن لم تبلغ الوصية نفقة أحج عنه من حيث تبلغ. If a person, he bequeaths the performance of Hajj to their heirs, he hasn't performed Hajj, they should send a person from his own city. So let's say a person in Sydney says that I haven't performed my Hajj, I'm about to die, I can't go, someone else perform. So rather than a person in Saudi appointing him to perform Hajj on his behalf, you should appoint a person in Sydney to do that. That is if his nafaqah or if his one third of his wealth allows that. If one third of his wealth does not allow the travel expenses from Sydney to Mecca for performing Hajj, then you can as easily appoint someone already present in Mecca to perform Hajj on this person's behalf. ومن خرج من بلده حاجا فمات في الطريق وأوصى أن حج عنه من بلده عند أبي حنيفة وقال يحج عنه حيث مات. A person proceeds from a city for Hajj, then he dies along the way. But before dying, he made the bequest of having Hajj performed from him. Let's say he came out of Sydney, he actually reached, I don't know if Malaysia comes before or after Makkah. Assuming, let's say Malaysia comes before Makkah, he reaches when he reached Malaysia. Now the question is, will the person being appointed from it start from Sydney or start from Malaysia? According to Abu Hanifa, start from his very own city, which means the person being appointed should be coming from Sydney. But according to Sahibain, rahimahullah, the Hajj can be made from the place where he passed away, which in our example is Malaysia. You don't have to appoint someone from Sydney to do that. And this is all happening if his one third wealth allows it, or if it doesn't, the waratha allow it. Because if it's less than that, then we've already established that from whichever place it is possible, even if it's within Saudi Arabia itself, you can appoint someone to do that. ولا تصح وصية الصبي والمقاتب وإن ترك وفاء. The bequest of a minor or a slave contracted to purchase his freedom is not valid, even though they leave enough property behind. First, understand a muqatab. A muqatab is a slave who's made a contract with his master that if he gets him a certain amount of money, in exchange for that, the master will free him. Now, let's say that a child is dying, so obviously a child cannot make a bequest. That's already established. But a muqatab who had gathered enough money to buy his own freedom, if he makes a bequest, that bequest is also invalid. Why? Because he hasn't paid his master yet, which means that he's not free as of yet. And if he's not free, then he cannot make a bequest. And so that's why his bequest is denied, invalid. ويجوز للموصي الرجوع عن الوصية وإذا صرح بالرجوع كان رجوعا ومن جحد الوصية لم يكن رجوعا. Retracting from the bequest is also permissible for the musi. And so if he announces that he's retracting his wasiya, that's a valid retraction. It was his wealth to gift in the first place. And if he refuses to gift, then he has the option not to. وَمَنْ جَحَدَ الْوَصِيَّةَ لَمْ يَكُنْ رُجُوعًا. Whoever disputes the bequest is not considered a retraction. One thing is me specifically saying that the wasiya I did, I'm taking it back. That's different. Then there's the other saying that I never made a bequest, right? That's not the same as actually making a retraction, because there could be a lot of reasons why a person disputes the bequest or refutes it. It could be to hide my bequest from specific people, right? In order to please them. For example, my waratha, I could say in their face that I made no wasiya, just so that they don't get angry with the musala. And since this probability exists, so that's why a rejection or a refutation is not a retraction. A retraction should be sarih, should be very explicit announcement that he's taking back a wasiyah that he already made. وَمَنْ أَوْصَى لِجِيرَانِهِ فَهُمُ الْمُلَاسُقُونَ عند أبي حنيفة رحمه الله. If a person makes a bequest to his neighbors, so which neighbors will be included? The neighbor who's living in front of you, whose wall is actually with touching your wall, I mean, your backs are to each other, who's actually on the right and the left of you with their walls touching yours. Like, who gets it? There are a lot of neighbors. You can't give it to all the neighbors, right? So who are the ones who get priority? And so Imam Abu Hanifa says that those adjacent to your house or the adjacent to the Musi's house get priority in receiving uh, the bequest, the wasiyah. ومن أوصى لأصحاره فالوصية لكل ذي رحم محرم من امرأته. If someone bequests for his in-laws, then those in-laws will be receiving the wasiyah who are ذي رحم محرم from his wife's side. So like brother-in-law, sister-in-law, parents-in-law, these people can get, or her or his uncles and aunts-in-law. They'll be getting the wasiyah. As far as the cousins of the wife are concerned, then they don't get the wasiyah. ومن أوصى لأخطانه فالختن زوج كل ذي ذات رحم محرم. Whoever bequeaths for his akhtan. So akhtan basically refers to the husband of every one of his unmarriageable female relatives. So the husband of your sister, the husband of your maternal aunt, right? These are all known as akhtan. So if someone makes a wasiyah for the akhtan, then the husbands of every one of those single female relatives to whom a person cannot marry, their husbands will be receiving the bequest. If 1/3 of a person's wealth allows it to have someone travel from Sydney and onwards, so that's the best thing a person can do. But if 1/3 doesn't allow it, then from Malaysia or from any other country nearby. Even if the Warafa do allow for a person coming from Sydney, but they shouldn't be tasked or they shouldn't be given the trouble of having to give their shares up for whole travel to Sydney. So obviously something that a fatwa can change on. I don't know exactly on which the fatwa is given, but in reality, any opinion which a person chooses from the two is valid and acceptable. وَمَنْ أَوْصَى لِأَقْرِبَائِهِ Whoever bequeaths to his close relatives, أقرباء. فالوصية للأقرب فالأقرب من كل ذي رحم محرم منه. Then the wasiya will be for the closest of his ذي رحم محرم, those he can never marry, those relatives that a person cannot marry. Obviously, does not include the heirs, except for the heirs. They already have a share in the mirath. They don't get anything. Other than that, those closest to him receive the bequest. ولا يدخل فيهم والدان والولد, parents and children are not included. وتكون للاثنين فصاعدا, and it can be for two people or more, because the word aqarib is plural, and the minimum of plural is, although in Arabic you have single, dual, and plural, right? In other languages you have only single or plural. In Arabic you have three distinctions in numbers: single, dual, and plural. That is the basic Arabic grammar. But remember, in wasiya and in mirath, if nine is jamun, I mean, even two is considered plural. In normal circumstances, two is two. It's not considered as a plural, but in wasiya and mirath, two is also a plural. So whenever a word of plural is used, aqriba, for example, which means relatives, as in plural, it can only refer, can also refer to two as well. Awlad usually linguistically would mean three or more, but in the chapters of wasiya and mirath, it can refer to two only. Ariqa, slaves, it refers to three or more in normal circumstances, but when talking about them in mirath and in wasiya, it can refer to two as well. So this is something really important to remember, that in the chapters of wasiya and the chapters of mirath, the Arabic language is same as other languages in which you only have single and plural. There is no dual in between them. Again, coming back to the masala, وَمَنْ أَوْصَى لِقْرِبَائِهِ, who makes a bequest for his closest relatives, includes the one closest to him, and those relatives a person can never actually marry. And this includes two or more, because he used the word plural. Now, is there any examples of what he's mentioned? إذا أوصى بذلك وله عمان وخالان فالوصية لعمي عند أبي حنيفة وإن كان له عم وخالان فللعم نصف وللخالين نصف. Supposedly you have two paternal uncles and two maternal uncles, and a person makes a bequest. According to Imam Abu Hanifa, he says that the bequest will be for, he made a bequest of what? Lil aqriba, for my relatives. Imam Abu Hanifa says that the two paternal uncles get the bequest and the maternal uncles don't get it. Why? Because the closest relative to a person are his paternal uncles and not the maternal ones. But if you have one paternal and two maternal uncles, then the paternal uncle gets half and another half is shared by the two maternal uncles. Because he said aqriba plural, which means it has to be two or more. And so one's given to the paternal, but since both the maternal uncles are equal in status, you can't choose one over the other. So the other half will be divided amongst them. That's Imam Abu Hanifa's view. وقال, but the Sahibain say, الوصية لكل من ينسب إلى أقصى أب له في الإسلام. That this distinction of having closest relatives is redundant, which means that The bequest is for everyone who is a descendant of the most distant paternal grandfather. In Islam. So let's say it goes back 3 generations. The Musi is Muslim, his parents were Muslim, grandparents were Muslim, great grandparents were Muslim, but great great grandparents weren't Muslim. So the threshold is the great grandparents. So all those male relatives, or in the case of a female relatives of a person who they cannot marry linked to their great grandfathers, all of them are equal in receiving the amount or in receiving the bequest. Not the one closest to the Mayyit, uh, the Musi, but anyone close related to the highest grandfather in Islam, the one who accepted Islam. The fatwa is on Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion, so you don't have to search through your whole family tree in order to find out who are the people who can possibly be entitled to the Musi's bequest. Your closest relatives get the first share. And about the levels and the closest of the relatives, that will come in Mirath in full detail, inshallah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Afterwards, he's basically giving different examples on the principle that we just established. And so hopefully we'll look at them in our next